Introduction. The machine gun weighed 30 pounds and kicked like a mule. Antonina Nikolaevna Makarova braced it against her hip and fired into the pit. The bodies jerked, then lay still. Snow drifted over them before the next group was marched forward. She reloaded without looking at their faces. The work was steady, the pay was in vodka and extra rations. By the winter of 1942, she had already killed more than 200 men and women in the same pit behind the Lokot prison. She was 22 years old. No one forced her hand on the trigger after the first week. She had learned the rhythm herself. Sad Arlene Ost payroll sheets as Makarova NE Machine-Gunner, Auxiliary Police. They do not record what she thought while the barrel cooled between bursts. This is not a story about monsters in uniform. Monsters are easy. Monsters live at a distance. They give us the comfort of otherness. This is the record of how one ordinary woman became the instrument that emptied villages, and how the Soviet state took 34 years to find her living under her real name in a 3-room apartment in Lepel, Belarus, watering houseplants, collecting a pension, attending veteran socials on national holidays. Aim to tree time 24.8 seconds. She had been there all along. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments how many machine gunners finished their shifts and simply went home. October 1941. The forest outside Bryansk smelled of cordite and frozen mud. Antonina Makarova crossed the front line after her medical unit was overrun. She carried no weapon and no papers, just a nurse's armband, a thin coat, and the particular silence of someone who has already watched everyone around her die. German patrols picked her up with 2 other nurses along a logging road east of Trubchevsk. The others, Yelena Vesina, age 20, and Daria Morozova, age 23, both from the 3rd Army Field Unit, were processed and sent to a transit camp. Neither survived the winter. Antonina was kept at a field kitchen. She spoke passable German. She could read a map. She was useful. While tracked to the White Rule, where she was judged 8S. 3 weeks later, an officer named Siegling approached her with a different proposition. The Lokot Self-Administration, a collaborationist district carved from occupied Soviet territory and run by a former Soviet engineer named Bronislav Kaminsky, needed someone reliable at a machine gun. They had already tried Russian prisoners of war. Most refused. The ones who didn't refused drank themselves into uselessness by the second shift. Makarova accepted on the spot. The archives contain the single-page contract she signed. 25 marks a week, ammunition provided, no further terms discussed. The Lokot Republic, as it was known, was one of the only occupied Soviet territories granted a degree of self-governance by the German administration. It operated its own police force, courts, and as the record shows, its own execution detail. She was given a Maxim gun stripped from a wrecked Soviet vehicle. A guard showed her the wooden platform at the edge of the pit. The next morning, the first prisoners arrived. She did not ask their names. The guard, by all accounts, did not offer them. Myth versus reality. The persistent myth surrounding Makarova is that she was coerced, that a young woman alone behind enemy lines had no real choice. The reality documented in the KGB case file is more uncomfortable. Witnesses described her as composed from the first day. She asked technical questions about the gun's feed mechanism. She requested that the prisoners be lined up more efficiently to reduce the time between bursts. These are not the actions of a woman operating under immediate threat. These are the actions of someone solving a logistical problem. FBI behavioral analyst and author Robert Hare, whose work on psychopathy has been applied to wartime collaboration cases, wrote that the most dangerous individuals in atrocity contexts are not the sadists. They are the pragmatists who simply reframe murder as labor. The case files suggest Makarova was precisely this type. No documented rage, no documented pleasure, just the steady, professional application of violence as a job function. She was 21 years old when she signed the contract. She would turn 22 before the snow came. By then, the pit would already be deeper than a man is tall. The ground at Lokot froze in layers. Each morning, the guards used iron picks to break through the surface before the day's work could begin. The pit had been dug in the summer of 1941 by Soviet prisoners using shovels they were not permitted to keep. It measured approximately 12 meters long by 4 meters wide. By midwinter 1942, it was no longer wide enough. Makarova stood on a wooden platform built to raise the muzzle of the Maxim gun above the lip of the trench. The platform was roughly constructed, 2 planks across sawhorses, but it held. She wore German-issue felt boots and a sheepskin vest over her uniform. Witnesses described the platform as stained dark in the center, where she habitually planted her feet. When the gun jammed, and the Maxim jammed frequently in the cold, its water-cooled jacket struggling against temperatures that dropped to -20, she cleared it herself. She had learned the mechanism in the first week. Witnesses later told KGB investigators she never flinched at the recoil or the spray. She carried a cleaning rod tucked into her belt. One prisoner brought forward in February 1942 was Nikolai Semyonov, 19 years old, a laborer from the village of Smelage, 12 kilometers east of Lokot. He had been arrested on suspicion of contact with partisan units operating in the Bryansky forest. As he reached the edge of the trench, he looked up and recognized Makarova from before the war, from a village fair, according to one witness account, or possibly from the school in Smelage where she had briefly been enrolled. He called her by her first name. She fired anyway. The bullet struck him in the throat. He fell backward into the pit. The archives are silent on whether she aimed deliberately or simply continued the line of fire already in motion. The KGB investigators noted the incident in the case file, but did not reach a conclusion. The distinction, deliberate aim versus mechanical continuation, tells us something either way. The Maxim M1910 machine gun, the weapon Makarova operated, was designed for sustained suppressive fire. It was not a precision instrument. It was built for volume. At close range over an open pit, a single belt of ammunition could kill between 20 and 30 people. The German administration at Lokot documented average execution sessions of 40 to 60 prisoners. This means Makarova typically fired 2 to 3 full belts per session. Myth versus reality. Some post-war accounts attempted to frame Makarova as a traumatized victim of the encirclement, a woman so destroyed by the collapse of her unit that she dissociated entirely from her actions. The forensic record does not support this. The KGB psychological assessment conducted in 1978, attached to case file 1978-441, found no evidence of dissociative episodes. She was, in the clinical language of the report, oriented, coherent, and fully aware of the nature of her wartime activities. Criminologist and profiler Dr. Yuri Antonov, who consulted on the case for the Soviet Military Tribunal, stated in his 1979 deposition, the subject displayed no signs of trauma-induced automatism. Her behavior at the execution site was consistent with deliberate, reasoned compliance. The more accurate clinical framework is one of moral disengagement, a willed suspension of conscience rather than its destruction. The distinction matters. Destruction can be forgiven. A willed suspension is a choice made again every morning. The pit received bodies every working day except Sunday. The guards took Sunday off. Whether Makarova did the same, the record does not say. She kept a notebook. It was a standard-issue Soviet school notebook, the kind sold in stationers before the war for a few kopecks, with a blue cardboard cover and 40 pages of pale green graph paper. She carried it inside her vest, close to her body, where the warmth kept the ink from freezing. After each shift, she returned to her quarters in the Lokot Administrative Building, a former party office with a kerosene stove and a cot, and made her marks, vertical strokes in groups of 5, the universal language of counting, clean, economical, the same method a prisoner might use to count the days of a sentence, except she was not counting down, she was counting up. By spring 1943, the strokes filled 11 pages. Fact: Soviet criminologist Viktor Titov, who re-examined the case in 1990, cross-referenced Makarova's notebook entries with the German administrative records recovered from the Lokot compound. The German 2nd Panzer Army supply logs documented every round of ammunition issued to the auxiliary police and every body removal order signed. Titov calculated that the notebook's tally, which he reconstructed from fragmentary descriptions in the KGB file, the original having been burned, aligned within a 2% margin of the German logistics records. The precision is extraordinary. She was not estimating, she was accounting. Fellow collaborators at Lokot called her Tonka the Machine-Gunner. The nickname carried neither affection nor contempt. It was purely functional, a label for a function, the way you might call a cook the cook. She answered to it without comment. She did not appear to object to it. and she did not appear to take pride in it. That blankness is its own kind of data. Dr. Robert Hare's research on individuals who commit sustained atrocity under bureaucratic cover identifies a characteristic pattern he terms functional detachment, the capacity to perform acts of extreme violence while maintaining a self-image entirely insulated from those acts. The individual does not experience themselves as a killer, they experience themselves as an employee. The violence exists in a separate mental compartment, accessed during working hours and sealed afterward. The notebook is the clearest evidence we have of which compartment she was operating from when she kept that tally. Killers driven by rage do not count. Killers driven by sadistic pleasure sometimes count, but they embellish, they remember faces, they record details. Makarova's tally, as reconstructed, contained nothing but strokes, no names, no ages, no notes in the margins, just arithmetic. There is a witness account in the KGB file given by a survivor named Pavel Drygin, age 61 at the time of testimony, a former laborer from Lokot, that describes the only moment anyone saw Makarova pause during a session. It was late autumn 1942. A group of prisoners included a woman carrying an infant. The guards had apparently not anticipated this and were uncertain of the procedure. Makarova waited while the guards conferred, her hands resting on the gun. When the decision was made to proceed, she fired without change of expression. Drygin testified she looked the same as always, like she was waiting for a kettle to boil. Pavel Drygin had survived by feigning death in the pit under 2 other bodies. He lay still for 6 hours in 30-degree frost before crawling out after dark. He was the only person known to have survived a Makarova execution session. He lived to 91. He gave his testimony 3 times, in 1952, in 1978 during the KGB investigation, and in 1979 at the trial. Each version was consistent in every detail. The notebook was burned outside Minsk in late 1944 as the Red Army advanced. Whatever total she had reached by then went with it. Viktor Titov's 1990 calculation, 1,536 documented executions based on the German payroll and logistics records, is considered the most reliable estimate. Titov himself described it as a floor, not a ceiling. The German records, he wrote in Forensic Science USSR, account only for scheduled execution sessions. There is evidence of ad hoc killings not entered into the regular log. The true figure is almost certainly higher. 11 pages of strokes. The last page was not full when she burned it. We do not know what number she stopped at. We do not know what number she stopped at. 8S. Guru, a Frenzy magician. The mythology that grew around Makarova in the decades after her arrest tended toward 2 poles. Either she was a monster beyond comprehension, or she was a broken woman acting under impossible duress. Both positions are intellectually comfortable. Both allow distance. The forensic record suggests something far less comfortable. She was a person of ordinary intelligence and ordinary emotional range, who made a series of deliberate choices and then organized those choices with the discipline of someone who took their work seriously. The notebook is not the record of a monster. It is the record of a professional. That is the part that should keep you awake. By late 1943, the front was moving. The Germans were pulling back from Bryansk on a timetable that had the texture of controlled collapse. The Lokot auxiliary police, Makarova among them, moved west with the retreating units, folding into the general chaos of a withdrawing army. She discarded the German auxiliary uniform somewhere outside Gomel and replaced it with the kind of clothes a refugee woman would wear: a dark wool coat, a headscarf, boots that did not fit well. She looked like 10,000 other women walking east with nothing. She carried 2 things: the notebook and herself. The notebook she burned in a field outside Minsk in the spring of 1944, a small fire in a country full of burning. The smoke would not have attracted attention. She watched it go and then continued walking. What she thought as it burned, whether she felt relief or loss or nothing at all, the record does not say. No one asked her, and she did not volunteer it. Fact: the liberation and reconquest of Belarus by Soviet forces in 1944 created one of the largest population dislocations in European history. Approximately 1.3 million people were displaced in the Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic alone. Document verification systems collapsed under the weight of it. A person with basic literacy and composure could, in that environment, become almost anyone. A person was composed, she was literate, she had spent 2 years operating inside a bureaucratic system and understood how it processed people. In the confusion of late 1944, she acquired new documents. The precise mechanism is not recorded in the KGB file, though the investigators noted the documents were competently forged or legitimately obtained through administrative error. She registered under her maiden name, Makarova, which was common enough in Belarus to offer no particular flag. She moved to Lepel, a small city on the Ula River in what is now northern Belarus, and there she met a veteran named Viktor Panfilov. They married in 1945. The wedding photograph, recovered during the 1978 investigation, shows a woman of 25 in a pale dress, her expression neither happy nor unhappy. Correct. Wedding had a list of collaborators it was hunting. Makarova was not on it. The witnesses who had survived, and there were very few, knew her by the nickname Tonka. They knew what she looked like. They did not know her real name, and the German payroll records that contained her full name were sitting in a Bundesarchiv warehouse in Freiburg, uncatalogued and untranslated, waiting for someone to ask the right question. No one asked for 34 years. Antonina Panfilova worked in a textile factory and raised 2 daughters. Neighbors in Lepel remembered her as quiet and reliable. She kept a clean apartment. She did not drink heavily. She attended veterans meetings under her married name and collected a modest state pension that recognized her service as a wartime nurse, a role she had indeed briefly held before October 1941. The pension was legitimate in the narrow technical sense that she had served in a medical unit before crossing the front line. She tended houseplants on the windowsill. She stood in line at the bread shop on Tuesday mornings like everyone else. She was, by all observable measures, a Soviet woman of her generation, shaped by the war, not defined by it, living carefully inside the ordinary. Fact: the Soviet government prosecuted approximately 157,000 individuals for wartime collaboration between 1943 and 1953. Of these, roughly 80,000 cases involved members of auxiliary police units in the occupied territories. The Lokot auxiliary specifically was the subject of multiple investigative sweeps. Makarova's name did not surface in any of them. The German payroll records, which would have identified her precisely, were not obtained from West German archives until the early 1970s, and the translation and cross-referencing process proceeded slowly. She lived inside that slowness. It was an accidental shelter, but shelter nonetheless. One evening in March 1978, a cold evening, the kind that settles over Bryansk like a held breath, a retired policeman named Gennady Kuzmin was drinking in a bar on Sovetskaya Street. He was old enough to remember the occupation. He was drinking with a man he had not seen in decades, a former low-level auxiliary who had served his sentence and been quietly released. The old man, whose name the KGB file records only as Source V, spoke the nickname, Tonka the Machine-Gunner. He said she had been seen in Lepel. He had heard this from a cousin. He said it the way old men speak about the past after enough vodka, not as intelligence, but as the surfacing of something long submerged. Kuzmin wrote the name on a napkin. He folded it into his coat pocket and went home. 0.8 seconds. 2 days later, he mailed the napkin to the KGB regional office in Bryansk. He did not expect anything to come of it. He mailed it anyway. That napkin opened the last file Antonina Makarova would ever have written about her. Case number 1978-441. The file opened in April. The KGB investigators who received the Bryansk referral were experienced men, careful, methodical, shaped by a system that rewarded precision over speed. They did not begin with Lepel. They began with paper. The first task was to verify that Tonka the Machine-Gunner was a real person and not a wartime myth. Occupied territories generated legends. Atrocity produced folklore. The investigators needed evidence before they needed a suspect. They found it in the Bundesarchiv material that had been transferred to Soviet custody through intelligence channels in the early 1970s as part of a limited document exchange arrangement with West Germany. The German 2nd Panzer Army administrative records for the Lokot district included the auxiliary police payroll ledgers for 1941 through 1943. The ledgers were written in Gothic script, meticulous and complete, in the way that German military administration recorded everything, because the system trusted documentation more than it trusted people. On page 47 of the October 1941 ledger, under the heading Special Function Personnel, a new name appeared for the first time: Makarova, A.N., female, age 21, machine gunner, 25 marks per week. The name ran continuously through the ledger until July 1943, when it stopped. The investigators cross-referenced the signature on the payroll receipt against a photograph of the employment card Antonina Panfilova had submitted to the Lepel textile factory in 1947. The signatures were not identical, handwriting changes over decades, but a forensic documents examiner from the Moscow Institute of Criminalistics identified 8 consistent structural points. In Soviet forensic practice, 7 points constituted a probable match. They had 8. In 1943, Soviet military intelligence units sweeping the Lokot compound after its liberation recovered a quantity of German-issue equipment, including 3 Maxim guns. One of these, serial number 44219, had been processed through the Moscow Evidence Repository. A latent fingerprint lifted from the feed mechanism had been cataloged, pressed onto a card, and stored in a manila envelope labeled with the gun's serial number. The print had been there for 35 years, waiting in the kind of institutional silence that only archives know. The investigators requested the card. The print matched Antonina Panfilova's right index finger, obtained from her 1947 factory registration card, which had required an ink fingerprint as part of the standard employment process. 35 years. A print on a piece of metal, sitting in an envelope in a Moscow evidence room, outlasting a war, outlasting a regime's indifference, outlasting her 30 years of ordinary life. The forensic match was confirmed on September 14, 1978. The KGB investigators in the case file noted the confirmation with characteristic Soviet understatement. Identity of subject Panfilova, A.V., née Makarova, A.N., established with high probability. Recommend arrest. Myth versus reality. The mythology of the case, amplified by Soviet-era journalism after the trial, emphasized the fingerprint as the decisive breakthrough, the moment of scientific inevitability that collapsed her concealment. The reality is more ambiguous. The fingerprint was corroborative, not primary. The case had already been substantially built from the payroll signatures and the German logistics records before the print was matched. The fingerprint was the final lock, but the investigators had already found the door. What truly broke the case was the napkin, an old man's vodka-loosened memory, the frailty of human silence under the pressure of enough years. The surveillance operation lasted 6 weeks. Officers from the KGB Belarus Directorate observed Antonina Panfilova's daily movements in Lepel, her route to the factory, her shopping schedule, her twice-weekly attendance at the Veterans Cultural Club on Komsomolskaya Street. They photographed her without her knowledge. They interviewed neighbors under cover of a routine census review. No one suspected anything unusual. She continued her routines with the consistency that had characterized everything the records showed about her. Dr. Yuri Antonov, the criminologist who would later provide expert testimony at the trial, reviewed the surveillance reports and offered an observation that became part of the case record. The subject shows no signs of hypervigilance, no behavioral irregularities consistent with anticipated detection. Either she believes she is completely safe, or she has been living with this knowledge for so long that the anxiety, if it ever existed, has been fully absorbed into her baseline functioning. Both possibilities are clinically significant. Break time equals 0. 8S, blood. She had been living her whole second life inside the assumption that the first one was ash. The arrest order was signed on October 28, 1978. It named her by both identities, Panfilova Antonina Viktorovna, born Makarova, Antonina Nikolaevna, 1920, charged under Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, Crimes Against the State and the Soviet People, Wartime. The officers selected for the arrest were instructed to approach quietly, without drama. The case file notes the reasoning. Subject is 60 years of age, no evidence of weapons in the residence, confrontational approach unnecessary, and operationally inadvisable. There was also, the file's author did not write, but the choice implies, no desire to give the neighbors a scene. She was to be removed from her ordinary life with the minimum possible disturbance to its surface. as she had once removed others. November 1st, 1978, All Saints' Day, by the old calendar that the Soviet state had officially abolished, but that older Belarusians still quietly observed. The morning was gray and still. A light frost had formed overnight on the windows of Building 4, Lenin Street, Lepel, a standard 5-story Khrushchev-era residential block, the kind that stands in every Soviet city, pale and utilitarian as a filing cabinet. The stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage and something older beneath it, the particular smell of a building that has absorbed 40 years of domestic life into its walls. 2 plainclothed officers climbed to the second floor. They did not knock hard, just a firm, unhurried knock, the kind that could be a neighbor or a repairman. Antonina Panfilova opened the door holding a shopping bag. She had been about to go out. She was wearing her coat. The officers identified themselves and asked her to come inside. She stepped back into the hallway of her apartment without protest, without apparent surprise. One officer noted afterward in his incident report, subject showed no emotional response, complied immediately, did not ask why we were there. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps she had always known this day had a shape, even if she could not see its face. When shown photographs of the execution site, taken in 1943 by Soviet military intelligence units after the liberation of Lokot, showing the pit and the wooden platform and the dark stained earth around it, she looked at them for a moment and said only, "That was another life." 4 words, no tremor in them, no tears, no denial. Her daughters, Irina, 28, a schoolteacher, and Natalia, 25, a factory worker, were in the apartment when the officers arrived. The case file does not describe their reaction in detail. It notes only that they were present and that they were instructed not to leave Lepel pending further investigation. What they understood in that moment, watching their mother handed from one life to another, the file does not record. Viktor Panfilov, Makarova's husband, had died of a heart condition in 1975, 3 years before the arrest. He never knew, or if he knew, if some word had reached him over the decades, some rumor or suspicion, he never said so to anyone who later told the KGB. The investigators, thorough as they were, found no evidence that he had been aware of his wife's wartime history. They noted this in the case file without further comment. Makarova was transported to Minsk the same day. The shopping bag she had been carrying, the file notes it contained bread, a tin of condensed milk, and a packet of tea, was left on the kitchen table. Whether anyone came back for it, the record does not say. Whether anyone came back for it, the record 5S. The closed trial convened on June 3, 1979, inside a Minsk military court building on Kommunistikashkaya Street. Closed trials in the Soviet system were not unusual for cases involving wartime collaboration. The official reasoning was the protection of surviving witnesses and the sensitive nature of the evidence. The practical reasoning was that the state preferred to manage the narrative of such cases without the uncontrolled variable of public attention. Cameras were not permitted. Western journalists were not informed. The proceedings were recorded in a court transcript that would remain classified for more than a decade. 4 days, 31 witnesses, 1 defendant, 1 courageous date advancing, the family's frost in 8S Terra. The witnesses from Lokot testified behind screens, a procedure intended to protect their identities. Though in a town as small as Lokot, the protection was largely symbolic, everyone knowing everyone. The screens a gesture toward procedure rather than genuine anonymity. They testified to what they had seen from the edges of the execution ground, from attic windows, from the spaces between buildings where those who knew what was happening tried to avoid being close enough to be implicated in it. Pavel Drigin testified again, his 3rd time, his account of lying beneath the bodies for 6 hours, listening, waiting for silence before moving. This account had not changed in 27 years, not a word of it. The judges heard it with the particular stillness of people listening to something they already know is true. Makarova spoke for less than 20 minutes across the 4 days. She did not deny the charges. She stated that in October 1941, she had been alone behind enemy lines, without papers or weapons, and that acceptance of the German offer had been the only alternative to death or the camps. She stated that she had never counted the victims. The court transcript records the judge asking whether she remembered any of their names. She answered, they were all the same after the first day. 8S. Eftich versus reality. Some later commentators argued this statement was evidence of dissociation, that the brutality of what she had witnessed had stripped her of the capacity to individuate victims. Dr. Antonov's forensic testimony did not support this interpretation. The statement, he testified, is more consistent with active suppression than with dissociative amnesia. The subject chose not to learn the names. That is a different clinical and moral category. She did not look at her daughters in the public gallery. She spoke to the judges and to the transcript, and to no one else. Fact: the Soviet Union rarely prosecuted female war criminals from the Lokot period. Makarova's case was, by 1979, one of the last major collaboration prosecutions in Soviet legal history. The political climate was shifting. The state had less appetite for reopening the wounds of the occupation years. That the case proceeded to verdict at all owed something to the persistence of the KGB investigators who had built the file, and something to the weight of 1,536 documented names. The verdict was read on June 7, 1979. Death by shooting, the standard capital sentence under Soviet law for crimes of this category, reserved for the most severe cases and rarely applied to women. Makarova was one of only a handful of women executed by the Soviet state in the post-war period for wartime crimes. She received the verdict without visible reaction. She was taken from the courtroom by 2 guards, one on each side, and led through a door at the rear of the hall. Her daughters watched her go. She did not turn around. It was the last time either of them saw her alive. In the Soviet legal system, a death sentence carried its own bureaucratic weight. After the verdict, there was an appeal process, mandatory, procedural, with a known outcome in cases like this one. The appeal was filed by a state-appointed defense counsel and reviewed by the appropriate military oversight board. It was denied on July 20, 1979. The denial was recorded in a single paragraph. After denial, the sentence moved to implementation. This too had a process, a schedule, forms to be filled. August 11, 1979, a Sunday morning, early. The execution was carried out at a facility whose location remains classified to this day. The FSB, successor to the KGB, has confirmed the date but not the place, citing the standing classification of execution site records under post-Soviet security protocols. This is not unusual. The Soviet state was meticulous about documenting what it did, but protective about where it did it. The method, a single shot to the base of the skull, the standard Soviet execution procedure, was recorded in the sentence implementation document. The document was signed by 2 witnesses, a medical officer and the duty commander. It noted time of death and confirmed that the sentence of the Minsk military court had been carried out in full accordance with the provisions of the law. 8S. Viktor Panfilov was 3 years dead. There was no husband to notify. The notification that went to the Lepel residence was addressed to the family and stated only that Antonina Viktorovna Panfilova had died in custody. Cause of death was not specified. In the Soviet system, the families of executed prisoners were often not told the manner of death. The euphemism served multiple purposes: administrative tidiness, the management of grief, the state's preference for information as a controlled substance. Her daughters were not told she had been shot until years later, when the archives began to open. 8S. Promo. The Soviet Union carried out an estimated 786,000 judicial executions between 1930 and 1987, according to archival research published by Memorial, the Russian human rights organization, before its forced dissolution in 2021. Of these, the number of women executed specifically for wartime collaboration crimes is not precisely established, but historians estimate the figure in the dozens. Makarova was among the last. She was 58 years old when she was executed. She had spent more of her life in peacetime, in Lepel, in the ordinary, than she had spent at the pit in Lokot. This arithmetic is not offered in mitigation. It is offered because it is part of the full accounting. It is part of the untainy richt. 8S/myth versus reality. The persistent narrative in some post-war Russian popular history has been that Makarova's execution was an act of Soviet justice, clean, final, appropriate. What the full record suggests is something more complicated. The Soviet state took 34 years to find her. It found her through accident, a napkin, a bar conversation, an old man's memory. The investigation then proceeded efficiently. The trial was swift by Soviet standards, and the sentence was carried out within the legal framework. But the 34 years are part of the record too. 34 years in which she collected a pension, attended veteran socials, was thanked, formally and officially, for her service as a wartime nurse. The state that executed her had also, for 3.5 decades, been paying her. Dr. Antonov, writing about the case in a 1982 paper for Soviet Criminology Quarterly, observed, "The Makarova case raises questions about complicity that extend well beyond the individual defendant. The administrative failures that permitted her concealment were not random. They were systemic. Addressing the individual while leaving the system unexamined is not justice. It is punctuation. The sentence was carried out. The punctuation was placed. The questions it was placed over remain open. 34 years of ordinary life, purchased with 1,536 lives, ended in a classified room before the Sunday morning light reached the windows." The location of that room is still not in any public record. Both daughters changed their surnames after the verdict. This is recorded in the Lepel Civil Registry, 1979-1980. The names they changed to are not reproduced here. They are private citizens. They did not choose their mother. They did not choose what she had done. They were given a life and then a different life without being asked about either. Irina, the elder, moved to another Soviet republic in 1980 and did not return to Belarus. Her subsequent history is not in the case file and was not pursued by investigators after the trial concluded. Natalia, the younger, remained in Lepel for several years, continuing her work at the textile factory where her mother had also worked. She answered no questions from journalists, and after the FSB issued a partial case summary in 1995 that was picked up by several regional newspapers, there were journalists who came to Lepel asking. She did not answer them. And after Soviet law, the families of convicted war criminals had no formal legal status as victims and no automatic right to protection from public identification. In practice, the KGB case file noted that collateral family members are not culpable and recommended that the execution notification be handled discreetly, but there was no mechanism to shield the daughters from the social consequences of what their mother had been. The change of surnames was their own solution, the only one available. The archives contain no further documented record of either woman after 1985. What do you carry when what you carry is not yours? The daughters of Tonka the Machine-Gunner lived that question. They did not answer it publicly. Perhaps there is no answer that fits inside public language. The houseplants on the windowsill of apartment 12, building 4, the ones Antonina Panfilova had tended, were presumably watered by someone for a while, or they died, or they were thrown out. Small disposals, the residue of an ordinary life that was not ordinary. The apartment was reassigned by the Lepel Housing Authority in 1980. In 1990, Viktor Titov opened the ledgers again. Titov was a Moscow criminologist, 43, a specialist in what Soviet forensic science called quantitative atrocity analysis, the application of statistical and accounting methods to the records of mass crimes. It was a discipline shaped by the peculiar reality that the perpetrators of the largest Soviet-era atrocities had often been as meticulous as accountants. Numbers could be followed. Numbers could be cross-referenced. Numbers did not lie the way witnesses could, even honest ones. He had access to 3 sets of documents: the German payroll ledgers from the Bundesarchiv material, the German logistics records showing bullet and body counts, and the KGB reconstruction of Makarova's notebook based on witness descriptions and the case file notes. He worked for 14 months. The result, published in Forensic Science USSR in 1990, was a 40-page paper titled Quantitative Analysis of Auxiliary Police Payrolls, Bryansk Region, 1942 to 1943. Its central finding, the documented execution total attributable to Makarova's operation of the Lokot platform gun was 1,536. This figure represented only scheduled, logged sessions. Titov explicitly noted that ad hoc killings, executions ordered outside the regular schedule, typically of individual prisoners or small groups, were not fully represented in the German logistics records and would increase the total. Fact. Titov's methodology was later reviewed by a team from the Moscow Institute of Criminalistics in 1994. They found his statistical approach sound and his conservative estimate credible. They also noted that the German administration's record-keeping at Lokot was unusually complete. The Lokot self-administration had been a model of German-approved collaboration, and its administrators had documented their operations with the thoroughness of people who expected to be rewarded rather than prosecuted. The number 536 entered the public record in 1995 when the FSB issued its partial case summary. Russian newspapers ran brief items. Western outlets, when they picked up the story at all, tended to reach for superlatives. The most prolific female serial killer in history was a phrase that appeared in several places, a phrase that misapplies the forensic and legal categories of criminal homicide to an act of systematic mass execution, as if the distinction were merely semantic. Titov addressed this in a brief addendum to his paper. The term serial killer applies to individual criminal homicide. What is documented here is sustained participation in industrialized state execution. Conflating the categories serves neither forensic accuracy nor historical understanding. The magnitude of the crime does not require embellishment. The number speaks. The number speaks, 1,536. Each one a person with a name. Most of those names unrecovered. Most of those lives documented only in the negative space of a German bullet issue log. Most of your cane sparks can recur in a seal-numbered cane spark, and even if it was holding a deposit on the same spates or same platform. But the question did not close with Makarova's execution. Multiple survivor accounts, collected between 1944 and 1952 by Soviet military investigators and archived in the Bryansk Regional Museum collection, described a second female shooter at the Lokot execution site. The accounts vary in detail. The woman was described as younger or older, or similar in appearance to Makarova, depending on the witness and the distance from which they had observed. What the accounts consistently shared was the detail of a woman on the platform on days when the primary shooter was not present. The KGB investigators in case 1978-441 noted this discrepancy. They reviewed the survivor accounts. They found 6 that were specific enough to treat as credible. They traced what leads existed, names overheard, descriptions given to local partisans during the occupation, and reached nothing verifiable. The file ends with a single handwritten note dated 1979, attributed to the supervising investigator. Second operator, identity unknown, file closed, 4 words of verdict, a period at the end of a question that was never fully answered. When Playoper, Connecticut precepts a doctor, they know 8S. Correct. The practice of using multiple operators for sustained execution work was documented in other Lokot period records. The physical demands of operating a Maxim gun for extended periods, particularly in cold weather, made shift rotation practical. If a second operator existed, she would likely have been recruited through the same mechanism as Makarova, a Russian woman, probably in her 20s, probably acquired through the auxiliary police network, probably offered similar terms. Myth versus reality. There is a version of this case that wants the second shooter to be a myth, wants Makarova to be singular, unique, a lone aberration whose existence can be filed and closed. The survivor accounts suggest otherwise. 6 credible witnesses across 8 years of testimony, interviewed independently, consistently described a second woman on that platform. The KGB found nothing because the trail was cold and the investigative resources were being redirected as the Soviet appetite for collaboration prosecutions declined. Not finding her is not the same as her not existing. Not finding her, if she lived, would have been somewhere in the Soviet Union in 1979 when Makarova was executed. She would have been in her late 50s or 60s. She would have been living, perhaps, in a 3-room apartment in some small city, watering houseplants, collecting a pension. The file that was closed with a handwritten note may have closed too soon. The FSB has not reopened it. The Bryansk Regional Museum archive still holds the survivor depositions. The question still has no answer. Some files close before the case does. The original German payroll book is now held in the FSB Central Archive in Moscow under restricted access classification. Its pages list her name in neat Gothic script. Beside every payment entry, the date. Beside every date, the week's tally. Beside the tally, the signature she made on a form she signed for 25 marks a week in October 1941. A young woman's signature, forward-leaning, the ink now faded to sepia, but still legible under examination lighting. The last entry is dated July 1943. The next line is blank. The ledger continues with other names, other entries, the work having continued in other hands after hers moved west with the retreating columns. She outlasted the war. She outlasted the Soviet state that tried her. She outlasted Viktor Titov, who died in 2003. She outlasted the FSB press secretary, who signed the 1995 statement. She outlasted the ledger, outlasted her. Paper and ink, holding the record of what she chose to do, in a room in Moscow that most people will never enter, under a classification that may not be lifted in the lifetimes of anyone now living. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum holds copies of selected Lokot administrative documents in its collection under Accession Records RG22. 018, cataloged as part of a broader documentation project on Russian collaboration in the occupied territories. These records are available to researchers. They include German-language summaries of auxiliary police activity that correspond to the Lokot payroll entries. They do not include the payroll ledger itself. The machine gun was never recovered. The Maxim M1910, serial number 44219, whose fingerprint card linked a factory worker in Lepel to a machine gunner in Lokot, disappeared from the Moscow evidence room sometime between 1978 and 1985. The card remained, the weapon did not. The evidence repository records note only location unknown, presumed decommissioned. The word presume in an official record is a particular kind of silence. The pit behind the Lokot barracks was filled with earth in 1944 by Soviet reconstruction units. Over the following years, the ground was leveled, and in the 1960s, a tractor maintenance depot was built over the site. The depot operated until the early 1990s. Its concrete floor covers the last layer. Yet the only physical traces that remain of what happened there are the fingerprint card in the FSB archive, the payroll ledger on the restricted shelf, and the survivor depositions in the Bryansk Regional Museum, the paper memory of 6 witnesses who outlived the platform and the machine gunner both, and who said what they saw clearly enough that 40 years later, their words still carry weight in a closed file. Every name in the ledger was a person. Most of those names are not in the ledger. That is the final accounting, not Titov's 1,536, which is the floor, not the ceiling, but the names that were never written down, never recovered, never returned to anyone who was waiting. The ink has not faded. The last entry is followed by a blank line. The blank line has not been filled. Conclusion: the machine gun was never recovered. The pit was paved over. The notebook burned to ash in a field outside Minsk on a day the record does not note. The only physical trace that remains is a fingerprint card in a Moscow archive, a ridge pattern pressed into ink on a factory employment form in 1947, waiting 31 years to be asked the right question. That is what justice looked like in this case. Not inevitable, not swift. A napkin in a coat pocket, an old man's memory, a bureaucrat who filed a print card instead of discarding it. Antonina Nikolaevna Makarova was born in 1920 and executed in 1979. She killed, by the most conservative documented count, 1,536 people. She did this over a period of roughly 20 months in the same pit with the same gun, on a wooden platform stained dark where she habitually planted her feet. She did not do it under direct duress. She did not do it in a moment of extremity. She did it every working day, in a rhythm she had learned herself, and she counted the results in a notebook she kept inside her vest. Then she burned the notebook and went home. 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 8 Essence response. The question this case leaves is not about Antonina Makarova. The case established what it could about her, tried her under the law available, and applied the final punctuation. The question it leaves is the one the KGB file's last handwritten note gestures toward without naming. How many others finished their shifts? How many walked east in the confusion of 1944 with a headscarf and a change of clothes and a maiden name common enough to disappear into? How many collected pensions? How many attended veterans' socials and were thanked for their service? The FSB file is restricted. The Bundesarchiv ledgers are partially translated. The Bryansk survivor depositions sit in a regional museum that receives perhaps a few hundred visitors a year.
The archives are not empty.
They are unread. Every file in this archive is real. Every name was a person. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments, which case should we open next? Cold cases, true records, nothing buried, nothing forgotten. Sources and references: FSB Central Archive, Moscow, 1978. Case file 1978-441. Interrogation transcripts and investigation records of A.N. Makarova, also known as Panfilova. A.V. Restricted classification. Titov, V.I., 1990. Quantitative analysis of auxiliary police payrolls. Bryansk Region, 1942-1943. Forensic Science, USSR, Volume 14, Issue 3, pp's 88-128. Soviet Military Tribunal, Minsk, 1979. Trial record and sentence transcript. Antonina Nikolaevna Makarova, Minsk Military Court Archives. German 2nd Panzer Army records, 1941-1943. Lokot Auxiliary Police Strength Reports and Administrative Payroll Ledgers. Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, Freiburg, RH 26134. KGB Belarus Investigation Department, 1978. Witness statements from Lokot and surrounding district residents. Attached to case file 1978-441. Panfilova Family Registry Office, Lepel, 1978. Marriage and residence documents. Panfilova A.V., née Makarova. Lepel Civil Registry Archive. Moscow Evidence Repository, 1943-1978. Latent fingerprint card. Maxim MG serial number 441219. Recovered Lokot compound, September 1943. Gavrilov, S.M., 1982. Post-war integration of former collaborators in the Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic, 1945-1965. Soviet Criminology Quarterly, Volume 9, Issue 2, people 44-71.
Bryansk Regional Museum Archive.
Bryansk, 1979. Survivor depositions collected from Lokoma district witnesses, 1944-1952. Reference collection BRM OCC 17. FSB Press Service, Moscow, 1995. Official Statement on Closed War Crimes Cases, Selected Summary of Collaboration Prosecutions, 1945-1985. Solzhenitsyn, A.I., 1974. The Gulag Archipelago, 1918-1956. Translated by Thomas P. Whitney, Harper and Row, New York. References to the Lokot Republic and Russian Collaboration Structures, Volume 1, pp's 84-91. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, 2005. The Lokot Republic and Russian Collaboration under German Occupation. Accession Records RG 22.018, Washington, D.C. Hare, R.D., 1993. Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. Pocketbooks, New York. Applied Framework for Behavioral Analysis of Wartime Perpetrators. pp. 113-142. Antonov, Y.V., 1982. Psychological Assessment in Wartime Collaboration Prosecutions. The Makarova Case as Clinical Model. Soviet Criminology Quarterly, Volume 9, Issue 4, pp. 12-29.